Hello friends, today I'd like to describe what I believe is the best way to proceed with phaco when you have a rhexis runoff and a grade 2 nuclear sclerotic cataract. So let's consider this patient who had a grade 2 nuclear sclerotic cataract with a PSCC. I'm starting the capsular rhexis, I'm using a Utrada forceps and everything is going fine till a point where the anterior chamber becomes progressively shallow with the loss of viscoelastic. You can see the visco leaking out of the open incision. Instead of reforming the chamber, I try to control the tear, and it is at this point that the tear travels outwards and it has definitely reached the zonules. You can see the almost rectangular configuration of the two edges. The further management of the case will depend on certain factors. First is an inferior rhexis runoff is more risky than a superior runoff because it bears the brunt of the trenching forces and is a mechanical stress point. Now the second thing is the grade of cataract. Up to grade 2 it is safe to go ahead with phaco, but in grade 3 and above you will definitely be walking a tightrope by your decision. The following is a good way to proceed in a superior rhexis runoff when you have a grade 2 nuclear sclerotic cataract, and let me explain this technique. So the first step is to remove this flap by creating a small tear in the intact rhexis edge and then rounding off the capsular rhexis to the runoff point. I'm making a small nick in the edge of the capsular rhexis with the help of the Utrada forceps itself, and then I complete and round off the rhexis and remove the flap. So there's a single runoff point that is seen at 1 o'clock position at this juncture. Pressure point 1, you must avoid cortical cleavage hydrodissection because this will impart a hydrostatic pressure at the runoff point. However, hydrodelineation is a must, and this is also important for successful completion of the case. So what you see is a careful hydrodelineation alone. There is no cortical cleavage hydrodissection. Once you have delineated the endonucleus, the management of this case will become a little easier, with very little forces being transmitted to the runoff point. Now with respect to phaco, if you are a divide and conquer surgeon, use sufficient amount of power with low vacuum. This is to avoid snagging and pushing the nucleus, which is deleterious. For direct chop surgeons, enough power should be used and high vacuum should be employed to lollipop the nucleus without pushing it down on the posterior capsule. So I'm first carefully uncapping all the epinucleus that lies above the endonucleus, and then I'm lollipopping the endonucleus with high vacuum and low power. So once I create the chop, you find that this endonucleus is slightly rotated, and then again I bury and I create a small fragment which is removed. Now the irrigation fluid that's coming out is also going to create a cleavage plane in the already delineated area, and surprisingly the endonucleus becomes quite free. So when I turn my bevel down and place it on the remaining part of the endonucleus, I'm able to simply remove it out and emulsify it in the central zone. So the nucleus management is quite easy by this technique of hydrodelineation. You have not imparted any mechanical or stretch forces to the runoff point, and therefore it is extremely safe. However, the big disadvantage is that the lack of cortical cleavage hydrodissection is going to leave behind a thick epinucleus which will be quite sticky. It will not display any tendency to move or rotate, and therefore it may be difficult. So what I am employing is I'm using a mechanical cleavage with the help of a Sinskey hook. Now this mechanical cleavage should be done by passing the Sinskey hook just underneath the rhexis edge and then slowly mechanically pulling it towards the center. And this has to be done with a lot of care and caution so that you don't create a zonular dialysis or a posterior capsular rent. Now you try to mechanically cleave as much of the epinucleus as possible. In the subincisional area I am trying once. However, it is very risky there because it is very close to the runoff point, and we don't want this runoff point to extend to the posterior capsule. I'm going to now confine myself to removing this epinucleus shell which is in the subincisional area with the help of a coaxial IA itself. You must use sufficiently high vacuum. Don't use a vacuum of 350 for coaxial IA. I use as high as 500 to 600 millimeters of mercury vacuum when I'm using coaxial IA, and the high flow rate will maintain the anterior chamber well. Be very careful while aspirating the cortex from underneath that flap portion so you don't create a zonular dialysis. Then I'm inspecting to see that the surrounding portion of the rhexis is intact and there's only a single runoff point. This will give me an encouragement to put the foldable intraocular lens directly into the capsular bag. Now the foldable IOL is then injected at right angles to the runoff point into the capsular bag, and that successfully completes the procedure. Thank you for your attention.